So let's connect the dots and tell us, do you see America being fundamentally transformed now, and is there an existential threat?
Well, I'm sorry to say I do think we're being fundamentally transformed. That's not to say that it's a hopeless situation, but it's very concerning. I think one more presidential election going the wrong way could do us in. Most obviously, there's Obamacare, a de facto government control of 1/6 of the American economy. And there are parts of Obamacare that haven't even kicked in yet that are very questionable constitutionally, ways in which what will become, in effect, a medical rationing board will make an end run around the constitutional power of the Congress. I could go on for a long time. Let's take regulation. The government regulation has expanded massively, most especially the EPA. Now think about our economy. Energy. Energy is the keystone of the economy. If you can get government control of energy, you have in effect gotten control of the entire American economy. And that is what President Obama is doing through his overreaching regulations with the EPA. Wasn't able to get his cap and trade through Congress. He's making an end run. Then there are things that are less well known. I've written about President Obama's war on the suburbs, his attempt to undercut the independence and integrity of local government. This is something most people don't know about. And there's a big and very controversial regulation that is coming out probably before long called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing that could totally transform local government and the way we live in this country. Most people don't know about it. Most people don't know about a whole level of regulation that is changing the country. And look at the family. Out of wedlock birth rates skyrocketed, way up. What about our power overseas? Well, that's in the news right now, the agreement with Iran, the chaos in the Middle East, cutting back our military to the point where it would be difficult for us to fight even if we had to. So yes, I think we're being fundamentally transformed, but the positive side of this is that precisely because President Obama is doing so much of this through executive overreach, a new president could change all that. But I think if we lose the presidential election, these things will become entrenched. I also fear that the conservative justices eventually will retire on the Supreme Court. President Hillary Clinton will replace them with liberal justices, and then I think it will be very, very difficult to claw back and find the country we had before. So I think we're one presidential election away from losing the country as we've known it.
A lot of people in the last November election thought that they added more Republicans to stop the fundamental transformation with the Congress, but we saw them stop fighting on executive amnesty. We're hearing whispers that there's not going to be a fight on Obamacare. How would you grade the Republicans as an opposition force to this movement?
Well, Ginny, I share the concern with the problems. The Republicans, we would like to be stronger. But I have to say that in the very big picture, I believe that the voters in these midterms have saved the country. It was argued that if Obama got reelected, in effect, we'd be permanently, fundamentally transformed. But precisely because we have a Republican majority, their ability to block these legislative transformations has given us the space to change the country back again if we win the next presidential election. Would I like the Republicans to be even stronger in standing up to Obama? Yes. But we sometimes take for granted what the voters achieved, what the Tea Party achieved in 2010, what the voters achieved in the last midterm. They have kept the country in play.
What are the stakes if we forget where this country came from?
Well, we've all heard about low information voters. And usually I think when we hear that phrase, we say, well, these are people who don't really understand everything that President Obama is doing, or people who don't know everything that Hillary Clinton did in the 90s. Well, that's all true, but it's really much deeper than that. If we don't know our history, if we don't understand the principles of American government, if we don't understand what the Constitution is, then we won't be able to understand that the Constitution is being potentially violated by, say, a president who's overreaching. We won't be who we are. And by the way, Ginny, the founders knew this and understood this. The founders had a deep concern for the teaching of history. They developed the Constitution out of their study largely of Greek and Roman history. James Madison did a major study of constitutionalism and history throughout the world as a preface to developing his theory of the American Constitution. And the founders believed deeply that if history wasn't studied, it would be impossible for a democracy to exist. What was foremost in their mind is the way the Roman Republic had been overthrown, taken over by Caesar and all the other Caesars. That republic had been lost. This is why Benjamin Franklin said the Constitution, the Declaration, all of these things are a republic if you can keep it, because they knew that the Romans had not succeeded in keeping their republic. So they were acutely aware of the fact that we could lose everything that we have. And without exaggeration, I can say that the founders believed that the teaching of history was the most important way to ensure the strength and continuity of the republic.
Why is the fight over American citizen and national sovereignty versus the transglobalists? It's so predominant. What do you tell people who come to you with things like that?
You know, you can't really be free if you're not sovereign. The United States is built on democracy. What does that mean? It means the people get to vote, the people get to decide. Of course, we're a Republican democracy, an indirect democracy, a democracy with checks and balance, but ultimately we're a democracy. Well, if another country or a global entity is going to tell you how to act, then the people aren't really deciding their own fate anymore. Now, this kind of concern is sometimes treated as a crazy conspiracy theory, but if you look over at Europe, it's happening right now. In England, in France, in Germany, because of the EU, you don't really have the power to fully legislate what goes on in your nation. The Europeans even have a word for this. They call it the European Union's democratic deficit. They recognize that the attempt to unify the European Union has undercut the existence of democracy in individual countries. There are literally large areas of life in European countries that cannot be legislated on without approval from the EU. Now, the goal of the people who favor global citizenship is to reproduce that in the United States, to turn international law and the United Nations into a kind of de facto expansion of what we're seeing in the European Union. So global citizenship in these terms is the antithesis of democracy. The reason it's happening is because the American left understands very well that its real allies are in Europe, are in the United Nations. And they think if they can create a structure in which American democracy is hemmed in by other countries, in effect that will be a way of pushing the country further to the left.
What are the dangers of excessive focus on race, gender, and class?
Well, Ginny, let me answer that at first indirectly. The people who focus on race, gender, and class are afraid to talk about the nation. They're afraid of nationalism. They're afraid of the excesses of war, super-patriotism, biased against people who aren't Americans. But you know, human beings have a need to belong. Human beings have a deep need to feel a part of something. Sometimes they even have a tendency, unfortunately, to seek out enemies. And the truth is that by undercutting the American story, which is the best way, the democratic way, the most respectful way, the way that emphasizes liberty and equality, for people to have a sense of collective belonging, what the race, gender, and class people are really doing is setting themselves up for a lot of dangerous mini-nationalisms, a kind of mini-nationalism of gender, or of race, or of class, which just becomes another kind of war, another kind of bigotry, another kind of hatred. And what we found in America was a way to give people fellow feeling based on principles of liberty and equality, not based on some birth, where you were born, pure ethnic belonging. Of course, we value people's sense of ethnic identity, but that gets overridden by these fundamental universal human principles. That's the safest and best way to have a sense of collective belonging, of fellow feeling. It's terribly dangerous to undercut that and to think that you've solved it all you're really doing is creating super patriots, dangerous patriots of gender, race, and class. It's a mistake.
Okay, let's discuss the emerging national controversy over the teaching of America's history. How's that coming up?
Well, Jenny, let me first situate the battle over AP US history, which we sometimes call APUSH, the acronym, in the context of the Common Core battle. These things are deeply related in ways that people might not fully understand. Now, David Coleman is famous as the architect of the Common Core. What is David Coleman doing right now? He is the president of the College Board. What does the College Board do? The College Board creates the advanced placement exams, including the AP US History exam, and examine a whole range of other topics: European history, physics, US government and politics, all across the board. Now, what is Common Core about? Well, fundamentally, it's about English and math. What about the rest of the curriculum? Well, that's covered by all the other AP tests. Now, why are we even having a controversy in the first place about AP US history? It used to be that the College Board gave out a little 5-page topical outline. As long as you cover the Jacksonian period, the Nixon presidency, whatever, you can teach this course any way you want, the College Board said to the teachers. But now the College Board has put out a very directive 70 or 80-page set of guidelines, which in effect force teachers to teach American history from a leftist, revisionist perspective. Well, the College Board and David Coleman are doing this with every single AP test. And when they're finished putting out all their guidelines, they will have taken over the rest of the curriculum. Common Core will have English and math. The College Board will have all the other parts of it. And David Coleman and many other people who fought the Common Core battle are now working for the College Board. So what you see here is an attempt to effectively nationalize the American school curriculum, done as a kind of end run around the democratic process. So the battle over AP US history is hugely important in and of itself, because it's all about how our young people think of this country and what it means. But even that is only part of a much larger battle over the entire school curriculum. I don't think people fully realize yet just how big this is. I guess the simplest way to put it is that it's talking about the bad and the ugly of American history, but not the good. And more broadly, we can say that the focus is on social conflict by gender, race, and class, rather than focusing on the traditional American story, the intellectual background of our constitutional system, the way in which our democratic principles have played out over the years. Now, that's all fairly familiar to your viewers, and I think part of what's going on is that the College Board is forcing this view, which is already dominant in colleges, on high schools, taking away the flexibility that teachers have to take a traditional approach. But there's really something more than that going on. Things have become even more radical in the world of progressive education. And now, believe it or not, the goal in American history is to somehow make American history not be about America. I know that sounds absurd, but in fact, the emphasis nowadays in progressive education is on transnationalism. The whole idea of America is considered bad and dangerous nationalism. No, focusing too much on America and patriotism could lead us into war and do all sorts of other nasty things, the progressives think. So they want to put our focus on the globe, on internationalism. How does this work in practice? Well, these scholars say Columbus didn't really discover America. He discovered the ocean world. He discovered the way in which the oceans could connect all the different continents. And then when you look at America in that light, the history of early America, instead of focusing on the democratic and religious founding of New England, which is our traditional focus, the focus instead becomes on colonial Virginia and the way in which colonial Virginia was tied to the international slave trade. And then you get all sorts of material that implies that somehow early capitalism was inevitably oppressive because it was tied to the slave trade, and Virginia was tied to this vast global system. So the traditional American story gets lost, And the global story, which is turned into a story of evil and oppressive capitalism, becomes the focus. Get it? Clever. Really, you have to take your hats off to these people. And then the framework itself, this new framework that the College Board has put out for teaching American history, is biased in so many ways. For example, anytime something comes up about what you might call a hawkish foreign policy, it's treated as something that was heavily debated by Americans. But if you look at something like, say, the student countercultural movement of the 1960s, that's portrayed as unproblematic progress. If they're talking about the origin of environmentalism, well, then it's said this was a response to very deep and serious problems. On the other hand, if the framework is talking about conservatives worried about the decline of the family or the crime rate, this is treated as a reaction from fear. If there's a discussion of the expansion of government under President Roosevelt and the New Deal or Johnson's Great Society, it's treated as a wonderful and necessary thing. But when President Reagan is discussed, there's no hint of the fact that his efforts to shrink big government were due to the failings of the Great Society policies. And so it goes on and on. The bias runs through the entire framework. And this is becoming mandatory now for teachers to teach American history to the top 25 or 30% of America's students, the ones who are going to be the people who control our culture. And if you look at today's politics, the constant focus on alleged oppressions of different groups, it all comes out of the history that these kids are learning when they go through high school and college. So this is absolutely critical to both the cultural and political battles that are focusing the country right now.
Tell us what's happened before, Stanley, when we've struggled with U.S. history standards in America and what they did to garnish their energy and come to fight again.
Ginny, I'd love to talk about the history of this battle over history. And the interesting thing is, it does link, you'll see that it links back into the Common Core. Back in the 90s, the first George Bush administration decided that it would be good to have national educational standards. So even Republicans at that time were in favor of something that you could see as a precursor to the Common Core. And then it bit back on them, because as they tried to authorize these standards, Lynn Cheney, being the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities under the first George Bush, commissioned the creation of national history standards. Sounded like a good idea at the time. Well, the whole project was captured by very left-leaning college professors. And what we got was this politically correct, highly questionable, hyper-revisionist version of American history. Well, when Lynn Cheney saw the results of the work that she herself had commissioned, she woke up and said, I'm going to fight this. And lo and behold, on her own, she was able to start an immense national debate, which went extremely well for the critics of these new standards. In fact, the U.S. Senate voted 99-1 to condemn the new history standards, and the one was a fellow who thought they should have been even tougher on the standards. So with that kind of unanimous condemnation, you would think that the battle had been won. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And these standards were revised in superficial ways. The most outrageous passages were changed, but the underlying orientation remained and seeped into the colleges and even the high schools. And this is a problem we're seeing now, because what's happened is that the colleges, which have fully pushed over to this gender, race, class conflict perspective, which undercuts the traditional American story and downplays it, they have now used the College Board to impose their way of thinking on all high school history teachers so that there's no escape. The battle has reemerged. And Lynn Cheney the other day came out with a part two, so to speak, of her original op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that kicked off our first national debate. She said it's happening again. And she said something else very interesting. She said at the end of her piece that she had learned a lesson from all of this, that if we have national education standards, essentially it's going to bite back. they're going to be controlled by one or another political side, and in the context of America today, they're going to be controlled by the left. So we've learned a lesson from that, and this really shows us the potential danger of something like the Common Core, of any kind of national educational curriculum.
What are the stakes of failing, and what tips would you offer to people listening to you on what they can do?
Well, when you're talking about the way the next generation thinks about America, you're talking about the whole ballgame. I've already mentioned today that our political battles right now, you look at the battle in Ferguson, that was linked by the protesters to hundreds of years of alleged oppression. And that link was used to condemn a police officer who further investigation has shown did not act incorrectly. And yet there was an assumption that this history of hatred and racism, constantly focused on in our history classes, must have meant that that police officer misbehaved, when we now know that he didn't, when we now know that the narrative was wrong. Look at the University of Virginia, the Rolling Stone article on the alleged gang rape, which now turns out to have been an invention. There was a sense that it had to be true because of a history of the oppression of women. The young people who are coming out of these history courses are being primed for these kind of bogus crusades. That's not to say, by the way, that we shouldn't worry about racial discrimination or gender discrimination. Of course, those are serious problems. But things have gotten to the point where we've detached from reality, because there's almost a yearning to recapitulate these historical battles and a refusal to realize the extent to which we have made progress on those very important battles. So that, I think, emphasizes the sense in which the minds of our young people and how they think about America and our history are directly connected to the most contemporary and intense battles of politics this very day. This battle over APUS history is playing out at the grassroots level in every state in the country. And I think you're going to see the intensity of it raising in the next year or two. You're going to see scholars coming out to condemn this new framework. I think you're going to see a new company emerging that could potentially compete with the College Board, offering a different kind of American history with, and this is very exciting, with new textbooks that could give a much more appropriate version of American history to our young people. So I think the same grassroots activists who are fighting the Common Core battle need to now link it to the battle over APUS history. As I explained a little earlier, it really is part of the same battle. The same forces trying to nationalize our curriculum through the Common Core are making exactly the same effort through the AP tests and the College Board. If grassroots activists can find legislators in their state legislature to introduce resolutions to condemn the College Board's new framework for history, to take steps to open up the AP testing market to competition, this would have a tremendous effect. It would, in effect, send a signal to competing companies that it's time for them to come out. It would send a signal to people who want to support those companies to invest the financial wherewithal that would be taken to make them a success. So grassroots activists can take control of this battle and really make a difference. And let me come back again to that point about the textbooks, because it's so important. This battle over APUS history isn't just a matter of holding back the tide, of stopping yet another advance, because if we really do end up creating a competing company, a company that could give alternative advanced placement tests with alternative textbooks, we would be changing the culture for the better. It isn't often that you can take that kind of positive step. I know a wonderful historian of America who says people often come to him and say, "What do you recommend for a textbook?" And do you know what he tells them? He says, there aren't any good textbooks. There aren't any good textbooks. Why? Because the textbooks all have to conform to these terrible frameworks put out by organizations like the College Board. If we got a real alternative to stand on its own, we could change the culture by putting out new, positive material. So there's a lot to look forward to in this battle. Well, it's unfortunately true that Howard Zinn's history of the United States, it's called A People's History of the United States, is on the one hand a far left, seemingly beyond the pale treatment of American history that traditionally Americans would not have taken seriously at all. Unfortunately, it's also true that Howard Zinn's textbook is now assigned in a great many American history courses. I myself know of a young man taking AP US history right now, and Howard Zinn is a required text in his class, along with a new textbook, which is the first textbook to have been conformed to the College Board's new framework. Unfortunately, these textbooks mesh perfectly together. The official textbook is a little bit more sophisticated. It is obligated in some ways to tell certain aspects of the traditional American story, but it downplays those. But in spirit, it is not that far from the Zinn book. And the kids are getting both at the same time. And I'm telling you, if just about any American president up to the last 10 years or so had seen what was in the Howard Zinn textbook and known that this was being taught to American kids as the story of what America is, they'd be rolling over in their graves. And so people do need to get concerned and up in arms about this. I know it sometimes seems as though the country is spinning out of control and there's just no time to focus on the cultural issues because they're critical emergencies right now on a whole set of policies. But if we take our eye off the ball when it comes to the cultural issues, we're never going to be able to turn things around. And the two things really do work together. The more attention we pay to the cultural issues, the more leverage I believe we'll have on the contemporary policy issues and vice versa.
Talk about the kids who are in situations now in a classroom where maybe they're tested on certain things or their textbooks have this kind of perspective on America. They want a good grade. What do you recommend to people struggling with this very issue right now?
Boy, that's a tough one, Jenny. That is truly tough. You know, the College Board says in response to criticism of the bias in its framework, well, students are free to argue with our approach if they'd like to. Come on, let's get real here. A student concerned about their grade and who doesn't really know this material approaching it for the first time, can you imagine them going against what their teacher, what their textbook, what the College Board is telling them to do? Yes, a few bright kids encouraged by their parents might have the gumption to do it, but I fear that they may suffer for it. They may be punished. So I'd like to be able to advise kids to go against it, but I'm afraid that realistically, even some of our brightest kids, even if they don't buy everything they're being taught, they're going to learn what the approved line is and they're going to learn how to mouth it. That's the sad truth. And that's why we have to fight this, because what the new College Board framework is doing, it's saying there is no escape. It used to be that at least there were some teachers out there who didn't go along with the newfangled approaches. They had the flexibility to teach as they saw fit under the old system. Now the College Board is saying it's our way or the highway. So we simply have to fight now. We have no choice.
With July 4th coming up, what would you say is the right way to tell the story of America in a positive, realistic way?
I'm going to plagiarize a little bit here. I'm going to be a copycat. I think Abraham Lincoln had it right. We admire the Gettysburg Address because it really cuts to the quick. It gets to the ultimate point. We are a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Then Lincoln harks back to the founding. It's these principles of liberty and equality, their rootedness in the founding, and then the effort to see how and whether they play out through our history. the ways in which we falter and fail to fulfill them or succeed. That is the core American story. That is what's getting lost and buried by this incessant focus on group identity and group conflict. That's what we've lost. Lincoln had it right, and what's going on now is the antithesis of all that. And Ginny, there's another aspect of what we need to do when we do things right. The way American history is taught nowadays in colleges, and I hope soon not in the high schools if our battle against these changes succeeds, but the way in which American history is taught in our colleges is always in comparison with an ideal present or an ideal future. They look back at the Mayflower Compact and say, well, women couldn't vote. There were still minorities. That's not the way to teach history. Of course, women couldn't vote. Of course, all of the rights that we're used to now weren't there. Of course, fundamental religious freedom as we now understand it didn't exist. But if you compare not to an ideal present or future, but to what was going on in the world at the time, you'll see that the Mayflower Compact and what was going on in the New England area in the early 1600s was far in advance of any other part of the world in terms of democratic participation. And the story of America has been the story of trying to expand those principles of liberty, which were just coming to birth at that time. Every time we teach in a way that compares to some ultimate ideal, we lose sight of the fact that we had to fight, we had to work for decades, for centuries, in order to even begin to see that ideal. We're studying the process by which we have made that battle. If we turn on it at every stage and say how unsatisfying it is, we are missing the fundamental point.
Critics will say that this is censorship by the right, that what's coming up, you heard it in Colorado when this has come up before. How do you respond?
It's really quite the opposite, Jenny. It's really quite the opposite. If anything, the College Board is censoring out aspects of American history. What do I mean when I say that? Well, if you look at the treatment in the College Board's new history framework or in some of the textbooks that are used by the College Board, what you see is the evils of capitalism detailed, one after another, in gruesome detail, whereas virtually nothing is said about the positive aspects of the free enterprise system. So I ask you, who is censoring who?
You wrote recently about Hillary Clinton and Common Core in education. What advice would you offer to Republican nominees for president on education policy as a contrast to the other team?
I think that Common Core could become a major issue in the next presidential election, and it would be a shame if Republicans were not to nominate someone who was strongly against Common Core and who could make a convincing case. Because Hillary Clinton is Common Core right down to the tips of her toes. Only recently she made it clear that she endorses Common Core, but for those who follow this issue, they know that Goals 2000, the predecessor of Common Core, was a Clinton production from start to finish. And Hillary Clinton was absolutely central to that. And Hillary's interest in Common Core goes to the deepest part of her political soul. Hillary has always been focused on children, on education. She had very radical views in her early writings as a legal scholar on so-called children's rights, which was really all about finding ways to detach children from the control of the family. But if you think about Common Core, it really is a large-scale attempt for government to take control of the schools, which ought to be controlled by the family, by local government, by parents. So I think Hillary would view the Common Core and a de facto nationalized education system as her ultimate playground, so to speak. And so to attack Hillary on Common Core is not just to fight her on what could become a very important issue, but to reveal her big government soul, so to speak. So I think Common Core could become the key to the presidential election, or at least a key, if the Republicans are smart enough to nominate someone who can take the battle to Hillary.
Hillary Clinton in Iowa recently called education a non-family enterprise. What did that mean?
Well, there you go. There you go. Now, I was just talking about the way in which Hillary Clinton's early work was all about children's rights, all about ways in which the control of the family over children could be undercut and, in effect, substituted by government itself. So Hillary herself is really showing us that she thinks of Common Core in terms of these early radical writings on children and families. So that's all the more reason why I think a Republican candidate could successfully use this issue against her.